Okay. Good afternoon. I am Crystal Nicole Donovan, and I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about how we can increase equitable access to coordinated specialty care. Here are our objectives. We are going to identify pathways to care, describe barriers, and identify action steps, which is always my favorite. So, just a very brief history lesson. In regard to coordinated specialty care and where did it all begin, I was actually recently reminded that there were some teams that were piloting some materials before the big RAISE study. But many of us know about RAISE, and there was this. So let me backtrack. So, in regard to our history lesson, according to my records, the first coordinated specialty care program, or what we know as coordinated specialty care for first episode psychosis, began in Melbourne, Australia in 1992. And shortly after, FEP services were established in the UK, other parts of Europe, North America, and Asia. And so here in the United States, again, there were some individuals that had found out what was happening across the globe, and we're looking at how can we do that here, but in like an outpatient setting, in a real world outpatient setting. And so that's where the RAISE, or the Recovery After an Initial Schizophrenia Episode study, came from. And so the question was, can that happen in outpatient settings? And the quick answer is yes. As we know, we have our team-based team. So, like an interdisciplinary team is the way to think about it. Also, there were greater improvement in clinical and functional outcomes. So, individuals were staying in treatment longer, but they were also able to focus on some of their long-term goals, such as working and going to school, and also really saw pronounced effects on individuals with that shorter duration of untreated psychosis that we're always talking about. So, we're thinking about the successes that we know are happening in our communities. So, you might be wondering, well, why are we here today? And I'm glad that you asked, because still access is not equitable for all of our community members. And so, we're going to talk about pathways to care. So, how maybe we can change all of that. So, pathways to care are a series of events or contacts during the prodromal and onset phase prior to someone actually arriving at your doorstep. And it's important for us to identify the events and contexts prior and during, again, the prodromal phase. So, it's not just about the time. And just as a review, when we're talking about a prodromal phase, we're talking about the period that represents a change in function before the onset of psychosis. So it's important for us to consider, like, where is someone living? Do they have access to transportation? Do they have gainful income? What does their insurance look like? Because equitable distribution of resources is happening in many of our communities and neighborhoods where participants reside. And so, again, in certain communities, we're going to see a significant lack of, and oftentimes it is layered. So, we're seeing a lack of grocery stores, for example, right? That's just a place to start. Think of a community where there is not a grocery store within a 2 miles radius. And then individuals also, right, struggle with gainful employment. There's not affordable housing. People are having to decide, how are they going to maneuver through their community, whether they have funds for public transportation or to put gas in their car. And that's important for many different reasons. But what we know is that lack of access is going to impact the length of time it takes individuals and their loved ones to reach a coordinated specialty care program. And understanding those pathways to care for individuals living in under-resourced communities. And I want to stress when we're saying under-resourced or when we're talking about resources, I'm not talking about a referral to a shelter or a gas card. We're talking about real sustainable resources to help people be successful. And so it's important because we also want to consider the quality of those experiences because they impact engagement during treatment. For example, this individual, his name is Mark. Mark is one of my favorite names. And Mark talks about his experience with first episode psychosis. And Mark has stated, I went to outpatient treatment, maybe 1 year steady, but I was still not in agreement from my diagnosis, especially the way it all happened, them arresting me and stuff. Mark was in his own neighborhood. He was hanging out with his loved ones, and he was then placed in handcuffs and he was arrested. And Mark was onto something because persons of color, particularly Black individuals, are more likely to be admitted to the hospital involuntarily. And I'm not going to read all these words on the screen, but some of the ones that stood out to me was the inequity, the avoidable, unjust, social and economic policies. And I was so grateful. I was listening to a doctor out of California yesterday, and he was talking about policies, and he was saying that he was talking about politics with a little p. And I found that so helpful because we can get caught up of all the things that are happening in the media. But when we're talking about policies, we're not talking about a specific candidate. We are talking about how do policies impact one's ability to move through their community, one's ability to be able to have access to resources, and then one's ability to be able to arrive and a coordinated specialty care program. And so when we think about Medicaid and Medicare and even the block grant dollars that help support many coordinated specialty care programs, that happens through the legislative process. And so also when we're talking about where one is able to live, where they work, what resources do they have in their community, even something that many of us take for granted, such as a grocery store, all of that also happens or doesn't happen through the legislative process. And again, those involuntary pathways lead to delays in the start of treatment and can increase that duration of untreated psychosis. And you want to remember that individuals are oftentimes part of larger systems. And so that longer DUP can contribute to wear and tear on family functioning and strain on our caregivers. And this is one of my favorite individuals and one of my favorite quotes. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. We are oftentimes very layered. And that is the same for individuals that are having mental health experiences. There are some individuals that are seeking safe and affirming care. And for many of them, it is an opposition, or it has been an opposition of specialized treatment. You know, many of them have reported that it feels like the two are constantly in conflict with each other. An example, and I will just read this to you rather quickly. We were doing someone's thought record on the board, and one of the things was that he was worried about was people judging him. And the doctor in charge was like, well, so what? So what if that happens? And I wanted to say, well, if that happens to a trans woman who doesn't pass, the odds are that she might get attacked or something. These things matter. So the fact is, you can't just leave all your identities at the door. And so at the beginning of the group, that was one of the statements that was made is that, I want everyone to leave all their identities at the door. And this other outpatient group participant that does not identify as trans could see how that could be concerning. And ultimately, what we know is that it could impact access as well as retention. Access, retention, engagement are all connected. But there are things that we can do, right? So when we think about our action steps, some of it is just thinking about trauma-informed practices. All of us have the ability to be more trauma-informed. It is a journey. I don't know if we ever completely arrive, but it is something that all of us can do. And this isn't about a specific trauma modality or intervention. We are talking about from the first phone call, from the time someone arrives in the lobby, checks in, all the way to the office, and then back out through the door. What are things that you can do to help new participants specifically feel safe? And sometimes it's just asking them, asking participants what makes them feel safe or unsafe. Asking individuals how they prefer to be addressed. Having honest conversations about relationships. I talk about relationships often, and they take time, and just being authentic about that. One thing I have stopped doing is saying that I speak for the voiceless. I don't believe that anyone is voiceless. There are just certain groups of individuals that are not often listened to. People do not often listen to their voices, and or they do not feel safe speaking up. We can have a whole didactic on peer support, and we will have one in May. But really looking at creating opportunities for individuals to engage in peer support, whether that is through your organization or also looking at opportunities outside of the organization. And then we'll talk more about, again, individuals being part of systems and looking at some of those community leaders. I won't spend a lot of time here when we're talking about outreach because I imagine many of you are doing this, looking at your email addresses, provider website, and collaborating with your social media um, personnel or staff members. But also want to consider some of those private practices, such as a primary care doctor, a family doc, internal medicine, but also, who are the individuals that are doing have private practices in regard to therapy and outreaching those individuals. So we talk about outreach, but oftentimes people are, only thinking about inpatient, thinking about, hospitals, and that plays a role, especially as individuals leave and new people start in a hospital setting, but we also want to think outside of the hospital because, ultimately, if you talk to me longer than 30 seconds, my goal is to keep people out of the hospital, right? We don't want people in the hospital. So we want other providers in the community to have information about first episode psychosis programs. Also want to, look at our high schools as well as our higher education institutions. Do want to spend just a couple minutes here. So when we're thinking about outreach and how we are, outreaching the community, we want to think about like those key supporters. So again, it's showing up in different places. So the trauma informed, those suggestions came from SAMHSA, and they are highlighting the importance of relationship with community leaders. And really thinking about how community leaders can also act as a liaison because something research has shown is that Black and Latinx families are less likely to receive family psychoeducation. And so, who are those individuals that they already have a relationship with, maybe already trust, and also thinking about how we can take that out of the organization. So looking at how we can target the neighborhood organizations, small businesses such as barbershops. I talk about barbershops, beauty shops a lot, but there are other small businesses as well. And then, considering those faith institutions, many people are connected to their faith institutions. They have a relationship with those leaders. And how can you start thinking about building relationships with them, recognizing again that all of that takes time. And then linguistic competence consistently comes up as well. Right now, most of the research is primarily on English, Spanish speaking families, but I know you are working with individuals um, that speak other languages as well. But, specifically looking at Latinx participants, most Latinx individuals experiencing first episode psychosis live with their families. And so, again, looking at individuals in your community that are already doing the work, who can you partner with? I know when I was an outpatient, we partnered with the organization and they were able to provide some interpretation services. It's not the same, but also, having conversations with your admin lead and others in the organization to advocate. There's an app for everything. And so, having an app, on your phone, on your tablet, that's going to help you be able to more effectively communicate with, those key supporters to be able to increase their psychosis literacy, and so ultimately, they can best support their loved one. When we're looking at school outreach, this is the language that was used in the Lynch article. They were at a Native American charter school, the individuals that were doing outreach, and they said they were doing going through their usual script, and someone raised their hand and said, "Well, wait a minute, you just described a medicine person in my culture." So again, in the article, they highlight cultural sensitivity, which I hope they were doing that at the front end, right? Anytime we go into a place, we should think about being culturally sensitive. But they did have to pivot and they had to start looking at functioning, right? So this was a high school, so looking at the teen and their ability to pay attention. Are they able to respond to the teacher or their peers? Are they able to, maybe just simply like turn in not just turn in their assignments, but be able to complete those assignments? And ultimately, when we think about shared decision making, what does the participant want? So we think about oftentimes, or you know, highlighting some of those what we call signs and symptoms, just using voices for an example. Some people, they're hearing maybe the voice of their grandmother, or the voices per se are not actually the thing that they are trying to focus on. So, really, again, want to make sure that we're asking people, what do they want? And then this is just a little clip from On Track New York. They have several little snippets. So this could be, I know some of you have already done some videos of participants and their loved ones, but it's just this particular one is a very short clip, just highlighting this Ecuadorian and Puerto Rican family. And again, just really helping, supporting this mom, increasing her psychosis literacy so she can ultimately support her daughter. And this is a neighborhood focused outreach opportunity from our friends in Washington State. And they were specifically focusing on Black men, providing information, and even the graphics matter. I know someone that had talked about being in an outpatient setting and they were having some conflicts in the lobby and just, did some very tangible, initially tangible strategies to address those conflicts. But again, asking people, what do they want? The participants also talked about they noticed the pictures on the wall, and this was a different time before 2020, but also the magazines, essentially no one on the wall, no one in the materials look like us. So it does matter. And again, in regard to goal planning, I don't expect that you're going to talk to all of the small businesses, all of the faith leaders, all of the schools at the same time, but it could just be helpful just to be able to start planning your outreach efforts out, even if they feel at this time aspirational, really just breaking some of that long-term goal down. I love a deadline. It's just very helpful for me. I'm one of the people that will also add steps, something I just completed, just so I can cross it off and then look at, what needs to be revised and then also what are your next steps. Because not only is another world possible, it is necessary. So thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me. And this concludes our didactic on how do we increase equitable access to coordinated specialty care.